that we have stepped back in time. The year is 1350. We are standing in the heart of winter, deep within the Northumberland countryside of England, or perhaps the snowy peaks of the Bavarian Alps. Before us looms a massive silhouette against the moonlight, a medieval castle. From the outside, it is a symbol of absolute power. Turrets piercing the sky, stone walls thick enough to withstand a siege, a fortress designed to keep enemies out. But as the winter wind begins to howl, tearing through the leafless trees and whipping around the stone battlements, a different question arises, a more human question. Once the sun sets and the deep, penetrating chill of the night settles over the land, how does anyone survive inside? We tend to romanticize these structures. We see them in movies with roaring fireplaces in every room and kings lounging in comfort. But the reality of a medieval winter was a battle for survival, even for the wealthy. Stone, after all, is a peculiar material. It is excellent at keeping arrows out, but it is terrible at keeping heat in. In fact, stone acts like a sponge for the cold, absorbing the freezing temperatures from the outside and radiating them deep into the living quarters. So how did the lord and lady, the knights and the servants sleep? How did they close their eyes in a world without central heating, without double-glazed windows, and without modern insulation, and not simply freeze to death before morning? Tonight, we are going to walk through the dim corridors of history. We will peel back the heavy velvet curtains, look under the wool blankets, and examine the ingenious, surprising, and sometimes bizarre methods medieval people used to stay warm. Relax, take a deep breath, and let us step out of the cold and into the castle. The architecture of warmth. To understand how they slept, we must first understand where they slept. When you enter a castle in the depths of winter, the first thing that hits you is not the warmth, but the dampness. The Great Hall, often the centerpiece of the castle, was a cavernous space with soaring ceilings. In the early medieval period, the fire was an open pit in the center of the room, with smoke drifting lazily up toward a hole in the roof. It offered a primitive kind of heat, but it was smoky and inefficient. However, as we move into the High Middle Ages, castle design began to evolve with warmth in mind. The primary defense against the freezing night was not just fire, but insulation. You might notice that the walls of a castle are incredibly thick, sometimes 10 to 15 feet deep. While primarily designed to withstand catapults and battering rams, this mass of stone created a phenomenon known as thermal inertia. In the summer, the walls kept the interior cool. In the winter, however, they took a long time to warm up, but once they absorbed the heat from the hearths, they held onto it. A castle that had been lived in and heated for weeks would be significantly warmer than an abandoned one. But stone alone is cold to the touch. This is where the decoration served a dual purpose. Those magnificent tapestries you see in museums depicting hunting scenes, unicorns, and battles were not merely for show. They were vital, distinct pieces of engineering for warmth. A bare stone wall radiates cold. It sucks the heat right out of your body. By hanging heavy wool tapestries an inch or two away from the wall, the castle inhabitants created an air gap. This gap acted as an insulator, trapping a layer of stagnant air between the freezing stone and the living space. So if you were a lord preparing for bed, you would retreat not to the drafty Great Hall, but to the solar. The solar was the private family quarter, usually situated on an upper floor, facing south to catch the maximum amount of sunlight during the short winter days. These rooms were smaller, with lower ceilings, making them much easier to heat. The fireplace here would be roaring, casting dancing shadows against the tapestries. But as the fire died down in the middle of the night, the room would cool rapidly. And this brings us to the most critical piece of furniture in the entire castle, the bed. The room within a room. In the modern world, a bed is simply a mattress on a frame. In the medieval castle, the bed was a fortress within a fortress. For the wealthy aristocracy, the bed was the most expensive item in the household. It was a massive structure, often carved from heavy oak. But the wood was the least important part. The secret to surviving the sub-zero nights lay in the tester, the canopy, and the curtains. A medieval bed was fully enclosed. A wooden roof, the tester, hung above the sleeper, and heavy curtains made of heavy wool, velvet, or brocade hung from all four sides. When you went to sleep, you didn't just get in bed, you sealed yourself inside it. This created a microclimate. By closing the heavy curtains, the body heat of the sleepers was trapped within that small, enclosed cubic space, while the temperature in the rest of the room might drop to near freezing, seeing your breath in the air. Inside the curtained bed, the temperature could remain surprisingly comfortable, hovering around 60 to 65 degrees Fahrenheit, purely from trapped body heat. But what did they sleep on? If you were a servant sleeping on the floor of the Great Hall, you slept on rushes, dried reeds, or straw scattered over the cold flagstones. It was itchy, it was prone to bugs, but it provided a crucial barrier against the freezing floor. However, for the nobility, the mattress was a masterpiece of layering. The base was usually a crisscross of strong ropes. On top of that lay a straw mattress, tightly packed. But straw alone is not enough. The pièce de résistance was the feather bed. A massive sack filled with down feathers, goose or duck, was placed on top. Feathers are one of nature's greatest insulators. They trap air pockets, retaining heat with incredible efficiency. So imagine sinking into a foot-deep layer of soft feathers. Then you are covered, not by a light duvet, but by layers of heavy woolen blankets, followed by furs. Wolf, bear, or fox fur spreads were common for the extremely wealthy, adding a heavy, impenetrable layer of warmth. Finally, sheets made of linen, a fabric that feels cool to the touch initially, but regulates body temperature wonderfully, were placed closest to the skin.
There's a misconception that medieval people slept alone in these giant beds. In reality, privacy was a very modern invention. In the medieval mind, solitude was synonymous with freezing. Sharing a bed was the standard, not the exception. It was a matter of survival physics. A single human body generates about 100 watts of heat at rest. Put 2 people in a bed and you have 200 watts. Put 3 or 4, which was not uncommon for servants or traveling guests, and you have a small radiator. In the famous Great Bed of Ware, a historical bed from the late medieval, early Renaissance period, it was said that up to 4 couples could sleep in it side by side. While the lord and lady might have their own bed, their personal servants often slept in the same room, sometimes on a trundle bed that rolled out from under the main bed, or simply on pallets on the floor near the fire. The collective body heat of several people in a relatively small solar helped keep the ambient temperature survivable. But what did they wear? Hollywood often shows medieval characters sleeping in full outfits or shapeless burlap sacks. The reality is more interesting. For a long time, the custom was to sleep naked. The logic was practical. Linen undergarments worn during the day absorbed sweat and oils. To sleep in damp, dirty clothes was a recipe for skin disease and, ironically, made you colder. By stripping naked and sliding between clean linen sheets surrounded by wool and fur, the body could regulate its temperature better. However, as the Middle Ages progressed and the Little Ice Age began to cool the global climate around the 14th century, nightclothes became more common. A nightcap was essential. We lose a significant amount of heat through our heads. A thick, knitted wool cap pulled down over the ears was standard sleepwear for everyone, from the peasant to the king. If your head was warm, the rest of you stood a fighting chance. Artificial heat, the pre-modern electric blanket. Even with curtains, feathers, and body heat, the initial shock of entering a cold bed could be brutal. To combat this, medieval engineering provided a solution: the bed warmer. Before the invention of the rubber hot water bottle, there was the metal warming pan. This was typically a brass or copper pan with a long wooden handle and a perforated lid. Roughly an hour before the lord was ready to retire, a servant would go to the main fireplace, shovel glowing red embers from the fire into the pan, and latch the lid shut. The servant would then slide this scorching hot pan between the linen sheets of the bed, moving it up and down rapidly to prevent scorching the fabric. The heat from the embers would transfer to the bedding, driving out the dampness and preheating the feather mattress. When the sleeper finally climbed in, the bed was toasty warm, retaining the heat of the fire long into the night. For those who couldn't afford a copper pan, nature provided an alternative: hot stones. A large river stone, heated near the hearth and wrapped in a thick wool cloth, could be placed at the foot of the bed. It acted as a thermal battery, releasing gentle heat for hours, keeping the toes warm, a critical factor in falling asleep, as warm feet signal the brain that it is safe to sleep. But the danger of the night. It is important to remember that keeping warm was not just about comfort, it was about safety. But the very methods used to stay warm carried their own deadly risks. Fire was the greatest friend and the greatest enemy of the medieval sleeper. In a castle, great fireplaces burned in the main rooms, but in smaller chambers, people might use braziers, portable metal baskets filled with hot charcoal. While these provided excellent heat, they were silent killers. In a room with the windows shuttered tight against the cold, a charcoal brazier could consume all the oxygen, leading to carbon monoxide poisoning. Many medieval chronicles tell of entire families who went to sleep warm and simply never woke up. To mitigate this, the fireplace design improved. The chimney, a relatively new invention in the 12th century, changed everything. Before chimneys, fire simply drifted up to the roof. With a chimney, you could have a fire in your bedroom without choking. The flue created a draft that pulled smoke out, but unfortunately also pulled a lot of warm air out with it. This is why the high-backed chair became popular. It protected the sitter from the drafts rushing toward the fireplace. The morning after. As the night wore on, the castle would fall into a deep, freezing silence. The embers in the hearth would turn to gray ash. The stone walls would creep lower in temperature. When morning came, the transition was abrupt. Waking up meant leaving the warm cocoon of the curtained bed and stepping out into air that was often cold enough to see your breath. Servants would have to rise before dawn, breaking the thin layer of ice that might have formed on the water in the wash basins. They would rush to rekindle the fires before the lord and lady awoke. Life in a medieval castle was a constant cycle of managing heat. It was a rhythm dictated by the sun and the season. They didn't just live in the castle, they wore the castle like a coat, moving from warm patch to warm patch, utilizing textiles, fire, and each other to survive the long dark nights.